Namaste, my friend. Welcome to Bhakti Yoga Conference, Grace in an Age of Distraction. My name is Happy Jack, the founder of Happy Jack Yoga University and a Master of Divinity student here at Harvard. And this is a conference series, really a speaker series, where we're bringing together, in the end, it's going to be 50 speakers. It went from like 30 to 40, now it's 50. It keeps growing, and that's a big part because of you and your participation, your engagement, your sharing it. At the moment, we've got over 3,700 registrants, and an intimate group of us here live. We'd love to have you live with us if you click the link. And if you have questions, please share them in the chat, save them at the end by raising your virtual hand. But we're going to get right into this. So I'm going to spotlight our dear friend speaker today. I'll say a few words. Please meet Dayal Gauranga Prabhu. He has been on a spiritual journey, leading kirtans and teaching spiritual wisdom for more than 20 years. At 18 years old, he became a monk and dedicated himself to a life of inner study, reflection, and service. 1 year later, he made his first trip to India and has since traveled back numerous times throughout the subcontinent, as well as to countries and communities around the world to learn, discover, and share the richness of spiritual tradition that he has received. After 10 years of monastic life, he transitioned out of the monastery, met his wife Rasika, got married, and currently lives in Brooklyn with their dog Jiva. Dayal is the co-founder, along with his wife, of the Conscious Earth Institute, a spiritually based counseling, education, and training organization to help individuals heal from the inner wounds in order to live life from a place of true self. I love it. Beautiful bio. It's beautiful to have you here with us, my friend. I want to just say a few words as well myself. So we met last semester. We were both in the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. There was a program called the Gaudiya Studies program. And we were peers. We were students together. But really, I was so impressed, not just with your knowledge, because of course you've been doing Bhakti Yoga, practicing for more than 20 years, but I was really most inspired by the way that you were embodying the teachings, of Bhakti Yoga. You demonstrated for me what it could look like in a real world application, in a school study environment, not just living at a yoga ashram. And truthfully, I feel like you're so thoughtful. You really tended to the needs of others first. You only spoke kindly to others. And I mean, not that I was a jerk myself, but there was something about you that, and I honestly, I can't quite articulate it, but it's a quality that I want to develop. I really saw that in your leadership, in the way that you spoke and engaged and connected. And from that moment, I knew at some point we were going to work together. We were going to, have some kind of a dialogue, and here we are. So the session today is called Integrating Our Divinity with Our Humanity: Trauma Healing, Spirituality, and Spiritual Bypassing. That's a good title. That got my attention. So my friends, if you are ready to get started and welcome our dear friend Dayal Gauranga Prabhu, please throw your arms in the air and loudly chant Haribol. Welcome, brother.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jack. I appreciate it. It's just such a joy to be in your presence, and everyone that's here from different places, all over the country, some people international. It's a real treat for me. This is a Bhakti Yoga conference, and a quality of a Bhakti Yogi is to see the spiritual spark in every living being and to draw out that spark with their own kindness, encouragement, love, and warmth. And so as you are saying nice, encouraging things about me, it's just causing a greater level of appreciation for you and your quality as a Bhakti Yogi to see the good in everybody and to bring that out. And you're doing that here for everyone that's live on this call, and for the weeks that this has been going on. It's really just a mammoth endeavor that is so beautiful and fruitful. And I just want to really acknowledge you for that. And thank you for giving me this opportunity. And I'm looking forward to sharing and also hearing from everybody else. Was there a way that you wanted to start by asking a particular question to get us going, or should I just dive?
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. Well, thank you first for the kind words. Really, I mean, I'm just modeling and inspired by people like yourself, truly. I mean it. I felt it in my heart the moment we met. I was like, I want what this guy has, just not, the way that you engage. So I really mean that. And so before we hand it over to your presentation, could you share a little bit, just so we get to know you, a little bit about your journey? What brought you to your spiritual path? You mentioned at 18. Some of us weren't so lucky. We found it later in life. But at 18, you found this path. And so what was it that brought you to the path and brought you to Bhakti?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you're sharing that, I actually that's where I'm planning to start my presentation.
Okay.
And maybe we can just get into it. And I will answer that question in the very beginning. Because I wanted to incorporate that the idea is that this is it's a big topic. Um, Integrating our humanity with our divinity with our humanity, which when you hear that might inspire you, you might be like, what does that mean? And then there's these big words. And my thought was just, let's just take the biggest, deepest, most confronting words and just throw them all into a title and see how it lands with people.
Let's do it.
And really, this could be a whole semester course exploring these ideas. So I don't want to give a false promise that at the end of 45 minutes, we're all going to be healed of our traumas and have a pathway towards integration. But I do hope that this can spark an ongoing conversation for each of us. And it could open our curiosity and increase our compassion of how we relate to our own stories of trauma. And I'm hoping to expand that definition for each of us and reignite a new way in which we can engage in our spirituality that is an honest way towards healing rather than what it can sometimes end up being as a maladaptive coping strategy for wounds that we're trying to escape brought about early on in life. And so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. And
Let's
the
do it.
place where I'm planning to start will be my personal journey, because let me just go ahead and start this here. And we can all see, yeah?
Yep, we got you. Perfect.
Okay, cool. So the reason why I integrated some of my personal story into the beginning of this presentation was that this isn't just a theoretical topic that I've studied in my life and I've read a bunch of books about and wanted to share with each of you as a research project. It's a lived experience for me as well. And my journey began, I was a child of the 80s and the 90s. This is me at 2 years old. My little choo-choo train there, little TV. You can I date myself there a little bit by the carpet and the size and shape of the TV that was there. And much of my spiritual journey today and the process of healing has been getting to know this guy right here. I grew up in Southern California, again, born in the early 80s. And it wasn't until later in my life where I started to recognize um, the impact that early childhood imprinting has on our later developments. And as you mentioned and shared in my bio, when I was 18 years old, this little guy decided that he wanted to be a monk. And this is my mom found this picture and put them two together. Me making a kindergarten, I looked like a tuna salad or something. I was not raised as a vegetarian. My service when I became a monk, originally in Laguna Beach, California, which is, I wasn't raised in Laguna Beach, but that's just where there was an ashram, and I joined in and moved there, was a chef and cooking. This is me in New York City years later at a place called the Bhakti Center. And I did that for 10 years of my life, a deep spiritual yearning for connection. There was something imprinted in me that wanted to understand myself, wanted to understand God, wanted to understand the purpose of my life. And after 10 years of living in a monastery in my late 20s, because I joined when I was 18, I felt something in me pulling me towards a new stage of life. I wanted to continue my spiritual journey, but in a different ashram, as we would say in Vedic lingo, a different phase of life. And I moved out of the ashram in 2013. I met my wife and we got married. This is me. We had a Vedic wedding ceremony at the Bhakti Center on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. We also had a Western style wedding more for my family. This is my mom in the background and my stepdad. And we've been married for a little over 10 years. And it wasn't until me leaving the monastery, which you can say the most spiritual years of my life were those times that I spent in the monastery. But it wasn't until I left the monastery and began engaging in the world in a more practical way, in an intimate relationship with another person, finding and seeking ongoing occupation, that I started to bump up against all the little ways in which I unknowingly and unconsciously use spirituality to avoid and mask over this little guy over here. His pains and his wounds and his experiences, which get buried and pushed into the subconscious. And 20 plus years later, after beginning my spiritual journey at 18, this is us now, just this last year. She mentioned I have a dog, Jiva. I also have a dog, Jago, now. Jiva Jago is the name of a Bengali song by a Bhakti Yoga saint that means wake up, sleeping soul. Jiva means soul and Jago means to wake up. And so we named our dogs Jiva and Jago. And when people ask us if they are adopted dogs, we always like to tell people, no, they are our biological dogs. So this is our little family right here. And so it's been quite a journey for me. And spirituality today means being able to integrate this whole path rather than compartmentalize and push certain pieces of my journey out of the way. And along the way, and this is where we'll get into the content we want to discuss today, is there are two patterns that can inhibit our spiritual development that I've discovered, very much so. That one is we struggle with everyday human experience, whether it's because of conditioning, ego, unresolved wounds. It wasn't until, and I'm not here to tell my stories of woe, and we all have our unique stories, but what we'll get into a little bit later when we discuss the idea of trauma is that we don't always acknowledge the impact of things on our life because we have a tendency to minimize or think that trauma has to be related to the severity of a specific event that occurred rather than the impact or the imprint that it had on us emotionally, regardless of the quote unquote level of severity that we might categorize as something traumatic. And so it wasn't until I was late into my 20s that I realized that my father was an alcoholic, the impact of my parents divorcing at a very early age, the impact of various experiences like that growing up in childhood, that it's easy to avoid when you bury yourself into a spiritual practice. And I'm not using spirituality as spirituality is therefore bad. Spirituality ultimately is the healing antidote, the healing pathway for us to discover our true authentic selves and heal from those wounds. But we have to ensure that we don't engage in one of the topics of our discussion today, which is spiritual bypassing, where we use spiritual practice to avoid our pain rather than transform it. So many of us are eager. We want to engage in a spiritual path. We want to experience something beyond the material. We want to go deep into our inner lives. But as we start to turn inward, we start to become confronted with things that either we're aware of or unconsciously unaware of. And we bump up against those weird obstacles, my addictions, my insecurities, my fears, the wounds of my conditioning, my wounded ego, my unresolved wounds inhibit me from engaging in the types of relationships and practices that I would like to engage in more deeply and regularly. And sometimes spirituality can be just seen as great. I don't have to deal with any of that because all I have to do is chant this mantra, wear these clothes, talk this way, wake up at this time in the morning, go to this church or this temple or this mosque or this building at a certain time and bow down to these places, and everything will just unfold and I don't have to worry about it. And that's unfortunately not the case either in my personal experience and the people that I work with around the world. So what we're going to do today is I want to do three things. Well, first I want to read this statement. This is sort of the thesis statement, you can so to speak, about the presentation that if there's anything I wanted you to take away with, it would be this statement right here, or your own wording of it. That true healing and lasting transformation requires integrating the spiritual dimension of who we are with the human experience of living in a body that carries pain, condition, and unprocessed wounds. And when I say body, our physical body, as well as our subtle body of our mind, intelligence, and false ego, right? So this is the integrating our divinity with our humanity. Yes, we are eternal spiritual beings that have a non-material quality of existence that exists beyond this world, beyond the body, beyond the mind, that is not traumatized, that is not carrying the wounds and the ego wounds that we experience. At the same time, that spiritual being that is our true essence is encased in matter in this human experience and is carrying that pain, conditioning, and unprocessed wounds. And so true healing and lasting transformation requires us to be able to face and go towards and integrate those things together rather than ignore one or the other. And so what I want to do is I want to be able to redefine trauma for us because it's a buzzword, it's a big word. Some of us have stereotypical ideas of what it means. Some of us might think it only applies to a very few unfortunate people that had a certain level of things happen to them. One of my favorite titles of a book that I admittedly have never read, nor do I know anything about the author, other than his name is Mark Epstein and he's a Buddhist psychologist, is The Trauma of Everyday Life. Meaning that it is something which is more relevant to most of us than we are aware or oftentimes allow ourselves to admit. So I want to just explore this word a little bit more so we understand what it means. I also want to explain spirituality in the context of trauma healing, right? Spirituality and the way that it intersects with our personal healing journeys. Then I want to give something, just a brief outline of a path to wholeness, just a few things for you to keep in mind that hopefully will be able to spark a new journey for you or encourage or ignite a new inspiration on the journey that you might already be on in your integration of spirituality and personal healing. So those are the three things I want to look at today in the short time that we have. And of course, there'll be plenty of time for, or at least some time, for questions and discussion and dialogue. So please bring your voice into the end when we have a few minutes to do that. So the first question, what is trauma? Again, we can give an entire semester course. You can spend your entire life answering this question and discussing what it means, both collectively for the world, as well as individually for ourselves. The World Health Organization mentions that a statistic that 70% of human beings in the world today will experience some level of a traumatic event. A much smaller event, but still significantly, some 280 million people will experience what psychologists and psychiatrists diagnose as a level of PTSD, meaning that traumatic event leads to some ongoing experience of internal unsettling and ongoing feeling of unsafety. And so it's something that is a growing level of research and something which is affecting large numbers of people on the planet today. And generally, it's defined. Stereotypically, generally, we think of, as I mentioned, trauma being defined by the severity of the event which occurred. There was a tragic accident. There was a significant level of abuse in my childhood. I lived through a war. There was a natural disaster. And we think about like there's some sort of scale. In psychology, they have adverse childhood experiences known as ACEs. And there's a test that you can take where there are 10 general understandings of an adverse childhood experience. And you mark, did this happen to you in childhood? And if every time you answer yes, that's a score of a 1, and it's on a scale of 1 to 10. And if there's a certain level that you get, you think, okay, I have a certain level of trauma. And many of us might score a 1 or a 2 or something relatively low. And we might think like, oh, there was no trauma in my life. But then the question then begs itself, why do I feel so torn apart inside? And this becomes a challenging scenario for many people where we look back on our life and we try to find events that justify the way I'm feeling internally, whether it's the depression, the anxiety, the insecurity, the feeling of being unsafe in my body, the lack of worthiness that I might feel about my identity or being in the world, my challenge and struggle to have intimate relationships with other people, my addictions. We look back and we think, there's no reason for me to feel this way. There's no reason for me to be struggling with this. And we have this sense of something being wrong with us because we're defining trauma as related to the severity of a specific event. But more and more, there's significant research being done by, and for some reason, these pictures are not coming up. Let me just go ahead and just going to pause this real quick because there's some photos there that I want to share with you that are not coming up. Let's try this again real quick. Give me just 1 second.
No problem.
Thank you. Okay, let's give this another shot. Cool. Okay. Game back on. There's growing research by psychologists, doctors in the field. All of these, some of you may have heard of. They may be new faces. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, Dr. Nicole LePera, Dr. Peter Levine, all PhDs, psychologists or psychiatrists in the field, all of which have best-selling books and which bring fresh perspectives to the idea of trauma. So I'm just going to read a few quotes on their research that help us expand this idea to understand what trauma is, not related to the severity of an event that took place, but more rather than the imprint that it has on our psychological development or our state of being. Bessel van der Kolk, in many ways, was ahead of his time. Many of us are just following in his footsteps, holding onto his coattails of a groundbreaking book that he wrote called The Body Keeps the Score, where he says that trauma is not the story of something that happened back then. It's the current imprint of that pain on mind, body, and soul. So it's not the story of something that happened to me in the past. It's the way in which the experience of what happened to me in the past is being carried forward into my life today. So there's two types of memory that he'll describe: implicit and explicit memory. Explicit memory is the general way that we think of memory. It's the storyline memory. It's one event that leads to another. It's the way that we create history. This happened then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. I was 3 years old when this happened. I was 5 years old when this happened. I went to school when I was 10. I went to college when I was 20. I graduated at 25. I got married at 30. I had my first kid at 32. I got my I was fired at 35 and whatever. We have this memory of things that are in the past and what's going on right now. That's our explicit memory. The feeling of trauma, however, is carried in our implicit memory, which is the emotional and physical storing of memory in the body and the psyche, which is why something may have happened in the past, yet there's a physical or psychological experience as if it's happening today. So trauma is that inability to be able to close off the events of the past and recognize that I'm currently safe here in the present. And there are different types of trauma. There's acute trauma, which is normally how we think of trauma as something that happened at a specific point in time, a specific event or an instance. But there's also chronic or developmental trauma, which happens over the course of time, where it's not just too much too quickly for our body and mind system to handle. Sometimes it's too little for too long. Ongoing stressful situations in our life where there's a lack of what we needed to receive in our childhood and upcoming development that left certain imprints on the consciousness that we carry forward with us today. Dr. Nicole LePera, more famously known in the field as the holistic psychologist, mentions that traumatic experiences aren't always obvious. Our perception of the trauma is just as valid as the trauma itself. So again, this goes back to her own experience of taking a score of the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, scoring a 1, which is a relatively low score, and recognizing that there is a level of impact that the world has us that aren't always explained by severe traumatic, quote unquote, traumatic experiences. And Dr. Peter Levine mentions that trauma is not what happens to us, but we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. So there's expanding of trauma to not just be defined by the event itself, but the impact it had on us. And so seemingly insignificant events that we might minimize or dismiss in ourselves or in others can actually have the same impact on us or another person that a seemingly justifiable traumatic event can happen on another person. And therefore, this is a quote from Nicole LePera in her New York Times bestselling book, How to Do the Work. The first step towards healing in mind and body is knowing what you're dealing with, identifying the unresolved trauma. And this is where I'm hoping this conversation might inspire some of us, if nothing else, is to be bold enough and courageous enough to not label or identify ourselves or other people, but allow ourselves the permission to acknowledge the way life has affected us in sometimes adverse ways. Because if we don't acknowledge that, then we're not able to address it. And then therefore, she says the next step is understanding the long-term effects of this trauma and how your learned coping strategies are keeping you stuck. So all of us have a variety of coping strategies to deal with the unprocessed wounds within us. Usually we think of the extreme, external, stereotypical addictions, alcoholism, sex addictions, gambling addictions, food addictions, narcotic or drug addictions. But there are other addictions. Many of them are non-substantive. Addiction to validation, addiction to power, addiction to anger, addiction to achievement, right? Some driving force within us that is trying to respond to a deep wound that's going on underneath us. And if we're not careful, to the topic of the conversation today, spirituality can fall into one of those maladaptive coping mechanisms, which is why I want to turn our conversation to the idea of spirituality as a path to healing versus a maladaptive coping strategy. Spiritual bypassing is when we take spirituality, which is the vehicle for healing, and we turn it into a maladaptive coping strategy by using it as a means to avoid and run away from our inner pain rather than integrating and working through it. So I want to look at what is spirituality in this context. And I want to turn focus to another leading figure in this regard who's inspired much of the work that I do today with my wife and I, who work full-time in the modality of internal family systems, which was developed by Dr. Richard Schwartz, who we'll get to in a moment. And one of the ways in which he defines spirituality, and one of the ways in which I like to summarize the idea of spirituality, is an understanding of connecting to and living as our authentic self. So spirituality holds within it the foundational idea and belief, regardless of religion, regardless of culture, regardless of practice, that our core identity is inherently non-material. Something beyond our physical body, something beyond the subtle mind, that there is a core sense of self, which is connected to a larger collective field of self, the seat of awareness. And spirituality is the growing understanding of what that is, understanding that self, I'm not my body, I'm not my race, I'm not my ethnicity, I'm not my gender, I'm not my career or occupation, I'm not my waist size, I'm not my bank balance, I am not my addiction, I am not my insecurities, right? I'm not my thoughts, I'm not even my feelings. I'm something separate and transcendent, understanding. And then a path to connect to that authentically. What does it mean to connect to that authentic sense of self and to live life from that place? And true authentic spirituality, and we'll get to this in a minute as we move to the end of our presentation, requires us not to leave behind our material stories, but to be able to integrate them in a way that is holistic and empowering. And so Dr. Richard Schwartz, who developed the internal family systems model, which for me is not the only, but I feel one of the most respectful and compassionate ways of practicing spirituality in a way that integrates it with our healing journey. So internal family systems model, for those that are unfamiliar with, isn't something that I'll explain in depth here, but it is a modality of healing that invites us to connect with a core level of self and brings spirituality into our inner healing journey. And he defines self or spiritual being in this way. This is from his book, Internal Family Systems. He's most famous for a book that he wrote called No Bad Parts. But before that, he wrote more of a textbook model for people really interested in the subject matter itself, just called Internal Family Systems Therapy. And he says, looking, observing, listening, heeding, understanding, feeling with, communicating, loving, we can do all this with our parts, meaning the aspects of our psychophysical nature, our physical and emotional and psychological parts of ourselves. But who is doing the looking, the listening, and the loving? Esoteric spiritual traditions have various names for the seat of consciousness. Quakers call it the inner light. Buddhists call it Rigpa, meaning Buddha mind or Buddha nature. Hindus call it Atman or the self. 13th century German theologian, philosopher, and mystic Meister Eckhart called it the God seed, and Sufis call it the beloved or the God within. In IFS terms, meaning internal family systems, the modality he developed, the key to mental balance and harmony is to access our seat of consciousness, which we call the self. And what this means is that across spiritual traditions, across histories and cultures, there's this shared understanding of a core non-material essence to our being. And true spirituality and healing is not to recognize that core spiritual essence and then leave everything behind. Great, I don't have to deal with my traumas. I don't have to deal with my core wounds. I don't have to deal with my insecurities. I just have to recognize the self and move on, throw me in a spiritual rocket ship and blast me back to the spiritual world, to Goloka, to heaven, to wherever it may, to nirvana, wherever it may be. But true spirituality is to recognize that core sense of self as the healing agent in our system, and then be able to turn compassionately in towards those wounded parts of ourselves and offer them the healing and integration that they've been yearning for. And when we do that, those wounded parts of ourselves, which normally feel like dead weight or anchors, can become relieved and unburdened from the wounds that they are carrying and get restored to the essence that they are, which are the beautiful resources that make us human. It's a constraint releasing model where the human being as a cybernetic system means any system is a collection of parts that operate in some sort of pattern. A cybernetic system is any system that responds to external stimuli in a way that regulates it back towards homeostasis, right? So a thermostat system, for example, in your car, in your home, is a small example of a cybernetic system that it responds to. If it gets too cold, the heat turns on. Or the cruise control in your car. You set the cruise control to a certain level. As you start going up a hill or down a hill, it adjusts itself and brings it back to a homeostasis. Human systems, beyond just being a cybernetic system that return to homeostasis, are systems that don't just return to a level of neutrality, but are built and geared towards restoring themselves to a level of creativity and intimacy, that we yearn for creative expression and intimate connection. And therefore, just there is the common feeling of frustration when we hear, I'm not living my potential, when we experience loneliness or isolation. The two biggest topics for anyone in their life is purpose and connection, career and relationships, right? Those are the two biggest things each of us are built for. And if we're not living a life of purpose through creative expression, or we're not living a life of authentic connection and intimacy with ourselves and other living beings, and ultimately spiritual source beyond this world, we're going to feel that frustration. We're going to feel like there's something out of alignment and something wrong. And the parts of ourself, our psychophysical nature, is the vehicle through which we're able to express ourselves creatively in the world through meaningful purpose, and connect and bond with others in meaningful, intimate ways. And so it's important for us to be able to discover and connect our inherent sense of self so that we can compassionately relate to the parts of us that were wounded by our traumas, rather than neglecting, erasing, or bypassing our way around them. I'll read that again. When we discover and reconnect to our inherent sense of self, all the ways that Richard Schwartz mentioned it earlier, and this is the unifying factor of religions around the world. Bhakti Yoga is not a religion. It is a path of spirituality that is found within a multitude of religions around the world. There is bhakti within Christianity, within Judaism, within Islam, right? It's a devotional means of the self connecting to a higher self greater than itself through devotion and through love and through service, that when we realize in its highest potential, expands and expresses itself to love of all living beings and to love of nature. It removes exploitation and replaces exploitation with respect, veneration, and ultimately service that leads to intimacy and connection. So when we discover and reconnect to that inherent sense of self, which different spiritual traditions may refer to differently, we can compassionately relate then to the parts of us that were wounded by our traumas, rather than engaging in this process of spiritual bypassing, which is to neglect, erase, or bypass our way around them. And this leads me to the idea of remembering, which I haven't counted myself, but what I've heard that the number one most repeated command in the Bible is to fear not, to worry not, which interestingly enough is the final instruction that Krishna gives to Arjuna in the revered Bhagavad Gita text of spiritual wisdom in the East, is to surrender and to fear not. Ma suchaha in Sanskrit, Krishna mentions, to fear not, the number one most repeated command. The second most repeated word that I've heard that exists throughout biblical literature is to remember. To remember. And one definition of this word remember, as I've heard it, is not just to recall and to bring back into memory a particular piece of information, but to remember as the opposite of dismember, meaning to bring the pieces of ourselves back together. So to remember who you are is not just to remember your spiritual essence and then forget everything else that you are in this life, but to bring the whole body, mind, and spirit together, to bring the pieces of ourselves back together, body, mind, and spirit. This is integration. This is wholeness. This is empowerment. So what I'd like to do is, to finish, I'd like to offer 5 ways in which we can do this. And I understand that these are very broad, general suggestions and principles. This is a format that my wife and I have developed with our Conscious Earth Institute based off the research that we've borrowed from other leaders in the field. We are simply stewards of knowledge and information that has been shared with us in our own healing journey as well. And there are a variety of ways in which each of these things can be done, but this is just a general overview and a suggestion for you to explore what these things mean for yourself. And so the first thing for most of us is to reconnect to the body in the present moment. Spirituality, I'll go out on a limb here and say, is an inherently embodied experience. Yes, we are not our body, but oftentimes our journey begins by reconnecting and being present within our body. Interestingly enough, as this is a Bhakti Yoga conference and a foundational text of literature used to study Bhakti is, as I mentioned, the Bhagavad Gita, which means the Song of the Divine, which is a several thousand-year-old Sanskrit text that describes the nature of the soul, the nature of our eternal constitution as living entities, and ultimately the relationship that we build with divine source. And it begins with the hero Arjuna, who is in the midst of his own ultra-traumatic experience on the precipice of a civil war. And there are a multitude of verses, specifically around verses 28, 29, that describe the visceral effect of Arjuna's experience in his body. It describes his skin is burning, his hair is standing on end, he is trembling, his mind is reeling, and he is forgetting himself, right? And so trauma is when there's this sense of lack of safety in the body. And as Bessel van der Kolk mentions it in when he mentions the ideas of yoga and meditation, that sometimes if we're feeling unsafe in our own body, how can I sit still and meditate? How can I sit still and try to focus my intention on my inner self when being present in my own body feels unsafe? And so we have to gently and courageously allow ourselves to take the steps towards reconnecting to our own body and being in the present moment. And there are somatic experiences in trauma-informed yoga. Yoga is a powerful practice that Bessel van der Kolk mentions in his Body Keep the Score. Happy Jack, the beautiful yoga teacher, developing a school of yoga. Ways in which I can really understand it. And The Body Keeps the Score, the title of the book from Bessel van der Kolk, is that the body is an inherent source of nearly unlimited wisdom for us. If we're unsure whether or not we're holding trauma in our psychophysical nature, whether or not there are unaddressed things for us to look at, whether or not there's some healing that needs to get done, find a way to get still and start listening to your body. Your body will tell you. Many of the ways I work with people in IFS therapy and coaching, people will show up. Sometimes they have something very specific they want to get into. Some people are like, I don't really know what's going on. I just know that there's this I want to change, or this, or I feel stuck. And we'll just start, what's going on in your body right now, and go with that as our trailhead as we talk, as we reference it as as the starting of what we need to look and explore. So spirituality is not a process of forgetting the fact that we have a body, but being able to reconnect to the body and being in the present moment. And from there, as I mentioned, being able to recognize the trailheads that lead us to recognize the wounded parts and our protective patterns. So many of the patterns that we hate in ourselves, or we hate in our partners, or we wish would go away in our kids, or we're disgusted by in our boss or our colleagues, or in the politicians of the world that we think are so despicable, that do destructive behaviors to cause harm to other people, are oftentimes protective patterns that have been developed internally in order to respond to the wounded parts in themselves. And when we're able to recognize that, we can able to recognize the protective patterns that exist within us and the wounded parts in which those are protecting. Got a little bit of a line here that came in through, so we will just welcome that and we'll roll with it. The third part is to relate to those parts with compassion and curiosity, right? We'll relate to those parts with compassion and curiosity. So oftentimes, when we start to get to know those protective patterns in us, our addictive tendencies, the part of us that reach towards addiction, the parts of us that are overly critical, the parts of ourselves that we deem as lazy, whatever it might be, another part of us will think, I hate those part of me. I wish it would go away. I want to kill that part. I wish that wasn't a part of me. And what that does is it creates a polarization within ourselves where those parts start to dig in further deeper and hold their ground. But when we're able to relate to compassion and curiosity, Gabor Mate has a beautiful quote phrase where he mentions, don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain, right? We can expand that phrase to say, don't ask why the behavior, ask why the pain that's driving that behavior. And that's curiosity is always the beginning doorway towards compassion when we're able to just simply ask the question, what's behind this? Tell me more about that, right? So to be able to relate to our inner parts with curiosity and compassion, and ultimately work towards releasing and repairing the burdens of beliefs held in the mind-body system so that we can return to the deeper self and feel your connection to the sacred, right? So there is no transcendence without transformation. There is no leapfrogging over the parts of ourselves that need attention. And ultimately, we begin by reconnecting to the body in the present moment, recognizing the wounded parts and protective patterns that are taking place inside of ourselves, relating with curiosity and compassion, so that, as I mentioned, release and repair the constraints internally, so that those parts which are burdened by those wounds can return into their natural essence, which are our inherent resources we can use to express purpose and experience connectivity with others, and allow ourselves to return or remember ourselves, body, mind, and spirit, and experience the deeper self and feel our authentic connection to the sacred. So this is what I wanted to share. I'm about ready to open up for questions, thoughts, and dialogue. As again, I know it's a big topic. My hope and my inspiration is that this just might simply ignite your curiosity and a greater dialogue with yourself to expand your understanding of trauma and psychological wounds and burdening that we all carry. Being more courageously willing to explore and acknowledge the way those burdens might be affecting our psychological patterns today. Being willing to see spirituality as a path towards engaging with those parts of ourselves that are experiencing those wounds, rather than trying to leapfrog over them or tell them to go away. And then being able to integrate all the parts of ourselves in a holistic manner so that we can experience life from a place of grounded strength and wholeness that allows us to curiously and compassionately relate to others. So that's my presentation, what I wanted to share with you today. As mentioned, Conscious Earth Institute is the place that's best. If you're interested in more resources around this work and the work that I do with it, you're all invited to keep in touch. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Jack, if you have any things you want to share, or turn us over to some questions and discussion with the group. Thank you so much.
Beautiful. Oh my goodness, Prabhu. Thank you so much for sharing, Dayal Gauranga. Outstanding. I think now you all get a sense, you know why he was invited, and wow, just like such impeccable teaching. Thank you. Thank you so much. A quick reflection and question, and then I see some others coming up. I guess I want to just understand, everyone here is on some kind of a spiritual path. We're all on this journey. Do many of us, from your work, do many of us actually spiritually bypass? And I ask because, there's people close to me who have suggested that I've, at times in my journey been spiritually bypassing. I see Ian nodding his head, sometimes maybe people say that to us. Um, you also said that it's not about identifying other people, but really it's more about acknowledging ourselves, right? So I know we're not here to point out others, but I just wanted to get a sense. Do you think that in some way, have many of us intentionally or not done some form of spiritual bypassing?
It's a great question. And honestly, I can't answer that for you or anybody else because I don't know your inner world. But what I will say is it's a mixture of both. For myself, 100%. I was an 18-year-old kid that moved into an ashram. All my parents and family thought it's a phase. What is he doing? He's just running away. And I was like, no, that's not the case. And the reality was it was a mixture of both. It's not one or the other. And the point of this isn't to just for all of us to say, holy crap, my whole spiritual life is a farce, and I have no spiritual sincerity within me whatsoever, and all of my prayer and meditation and yoga is just a coping mechanism for pain and trauma. And that's not the case. It's a mixture of both. And there is a level of sincerity and spiritual um earnestness that we have in our path. And if we're honest, I can say for myself, 100%. 100%. It was a way in which I was able to escape and run away from certain things in my life. But the beauty of it is that if we're honest and authentic about it, our spirituality becomes the very means in which we can work through that, right? And so it's a much better coping mechanism than a lot of other things in our life. And as long as we're sincere in that effort, gradually the level in which we're spiritual bypassing will become less, and the level in which we're authentically engaging in sincere spiritual practice will increase. And so it really is a lot of grayness, and we have to have maturity to hold space for that and be honest and vulnerable and earnest in our endeavor.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Let's take some questions. We got Nityananda Chandra on. I think he's residing in the same great city of New York.
Yeah, in Brooklyn,
Brother.
not too far. We're semi neighbors. Good to see you, Nityananda.
Good to see you. Good to see you. Just a little addition. You said the last instruction of Krishna's "Do not fear," and it's also Krishna's first instruction.
Yeah,
Asochan, do not fear. And the interesting thing is, it's basically the A to Z. Like the first letter in Sanskrit is A, and the last letter in Sanskrit is Ha. And so Krishna starts off with Ashochan, do not fear, and Ma Sucha Ha, do not fear.
yeah,
So from A to Z, he's saying this same message.
yeah. That's a beautiful reflection. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Prabhu. I love it. We got a number of hands up. If one of you can come on video, and then we can actually spotlight you, either Jay or Lucinda or Iravati. I see Iravati's on video. It's just easier to bring you on in this way. Iravati, welcome if you hit the unmute button.
Hare Krishna. Thank you very much, Jack, for all this series of very useful guests and knowledge. And thank you to our guests today. I can resonate with everything you both said. And I would have a question about a recent psychologist saying in his report that most of people are just weak and going for therapy because they want to become strong. But in the reality, they don't want to solve their problem. And the strong people, they actually don't go for therapy for years. they just put it into practice. They just daily try something that will work to heal. So I wanted to ask about your opinion about this. Is it just a individual report I've read, or is there any supported experience that you have with your wife? Because I feel like I'm being more like the big one. I'm just in theory trying to heal, and I did heal in many years, but changes are not as I would like them to be after so many years. Let's say I'm talking about 35 years of working on my inner self and trying very much not to bypass in my spiritual sadhana and practice.
Thank you, Iravati. If I can reflect your question, understand what you're asking, are you wondering how to reply to a statement or belief that to go to therapy or seek some sort of help in that regard is a form of weakness?
No. The question is more about many people try to heal, but not many succeed.
Yeah.
How come?
Oh, great. That's a great question. And it actually relates to a question I saw in the chat that I really wanted to address from Skip. This is what distinguishes spirituality from psychology? The two are so closely related in the talk that I wonder whether spirituality is not being psychologized. Yes. So many people do attempt to heal or approach psychology or therapy and struggle in various ways. And the idea of spirituality, again, is that we have an inherent sense of spiritual essence of who we are. Psychology, in many ways, is a cognitive process where I'm just trying to understand what happened and approach it from a level of the mind. It's not going to give me access to that inherent sense of spiritual being that I am. And unless we can connect to that spiritual sense of self, and that self being the one that compassionately relates to the parts of me that have been wounded or traumatized or hurt or in a need of healing, it's just going to remain some sort of cognitive process. And so real healing takes place when we connect to something greater than ourselves. 12-step programs recognize the idea of ultimately on my own, I'm unable to be able to manage my life effectively in the face of whatever I'm challenged by. And there's a higher power, something greater than myself that ultimately I need to connect to in order to work through this. Any type of authentic healing or inner development has to lead us back to a spiritual understanding of who we are beyond the body and the mind. But that spiritual understanding isn't meant to then neglect and leave all of that behind us, but to be able to turn towards and integrate those pieces of ourselves and enact healing. So there's something about the spiritual self, which is a healing and presence or healing factor in that journey. So I genuinely think that most oftentimes it's a lack of spiritual connection that leaves us wanting more in our psychological and therapeutic endeavors.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Iravati, Nandini. Just quickly say where you're calling in from so we can send you some love.
Calling from Slovenia.
Slovenia. Beautiful. We're sending all of our love, gratitude, appreciation to Slovenia. Beautiful question.
Thank you, Jack. And I'm sending to everybody Sri Panchatattva's love. I'm trying to connect through them.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
I love that. And thank you as well, Skip, a resident scholar from Yale/Harvard. I'm gonna bring Laura on next. Just again, it's just nice to have a visual. Laura in the great state of Illinois.
Hey, Laura.
Hi, Dayal.
Laura and I met in India a little while ago.
Yes, we did. It's so wonderful to hear you and learn from you this morning. Thank you. And happy Jack for having such a wonderful platform for all these great teachers. I just have a simple reflection other than saying thank you and love being here with everyone today is that I think the thing that has been missing for me recently is to spend the time to meditate, to be able to do the four things, to reconnect, recognize, relate, and return, is that I'm not taking the time to have the quiet, to meditate, and will today. You know, and aside from, you know, doing our chanting, just the quiet of meditation. And
Yeah.
I think you've really reminded me of that. In order to return to some of these things and these issues, I need to have that quiet time. So thanks for that reminder and having this time this morning.
Thank you, Laura, so much. Glad you're here.
I love it. Thank you so much, Laura. We're sending our love, high vibes to Illinois. Amazing. Well, we got maybe one more share we can sneak on. I was messaging with Hanna. Where'd you go, Hanna? There you are. Hanna, she's actually the co-founder of Happy Jack Yoga, and I was messaging with
Beautiful.
her. She's very much studying a lot of this right now. But Hanna, any final reflections? We got you.
We can't hear you for some reason, dear
Can't hear
Hannah.
you, even though you're not on mute. That's the weirdest. Something to do with your mic. Unplug
Now
your
you're
mic.
muted.
Yeah, now we get you back off mute.
How about now?
Yeah, that's good.
Great. Thank you. First of all, thank you. I love that this topic is part of our Bhakti conversations. And I love that you brought the IFS model. And for those who are not used to it, I think it's like we're talking about how Krishna said not to be fearful. And I think the IFS method can help in that for those who want to work on ourselves and our traumas. If we think about the IFS as like, there's a part of me that is a 3-year-old girl. That's an IFS thing. Like, that's a part of me that is traumatized. There's a part of me that isn't. And that's what you, Dayal, said is the self, right? And it's our soul. And I love how that can help us in processing, because sometimes trauma can feel overwhelming and we might numb out. I think a lot of our defense mechanisms can come out as a defense or as a numbing. And so with the IFS, I think it's easier to approach the parts of ourselves that might carry pain. And then to know that there is a bigger picture. And it made me think about, I'm not an expert in the 12-step system, but what they say is also a little bit like the IFS says that you don't have to necessarily believe in God. Someone in our community, Kiernan, said this. You don't have to believe in God, but you have to believe that you're not God. So that creates a space, like a bigger context. And it seems to me that healing really is kind of requires some certain sense of spirituality or some connection to a bigger source than just my little self. There has to figure everything out. And then I wanted to ask or kind of suggest, I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts on this. I love this book. It's called The Heart of Trauma, and it's written by Bonnie Baden-Noch. I don't know how to say her name. And she says that what kind of events is it that kind of risk becoming a trauma? And she asks that question and she answers it with kind of like our relational brain, in that if we, like, our perception of being alone with whatever happened is what risks to kind of make it into an embodied trauma. Or if we perceive that we're alone in something that happened or that we have to hide it, or then there's the layers of shame. And I wanted to ask you what you think about that, because we didn't touch on shame at all in this conversation, as far as I could tell. How does that sound in our mind?
Well, I'll answer briefly just for the sake of time, but you brought up a lot of really great things, and thank you so much for that. Shame carries an inherent sense of belief and identity. Not that I did something wrong, but I am wrong. Not that I made a mistake. I am a mistake. I am unworthy. It carries an inherent sense of belief, which is antithetical to the idea of who we really are spiritually. And so my genuine belief and understanding is that true healing can't take place outside of a spiritual context, because it requires us to reconnect to the truth of who we actually are, separate from our pain and our trauma and our wounding. And we can see sometimes the wounding or pain or traumas in our life as the necessary catalyst for us to turn towards our authentic sense of spiritual being and a power greater than ourselves, in a way that we never would have otherwise. And so ultimately, the path back to ourself is usually not straightforward and is often bumpy. In 12-step world, they'll call it a rock bottom, right? In our general living of life, it just might be whatever situations or circumstances in our life that force us to recognize that there's a need for me to reconnect to something deeper and stronger. And something that I share with others is that sometimes everything in our life needs to fall apart in order for us to discover what's truly indestructible within us, right? That everything sometimes needs to fall apart around us in order to discover what's indestructible within us. And so that's ultimately the path of integration that we're looking towards. And so shame is that belief that I am something wrong or bad or terrible. Spirituality is understanding who I really am. And sometimes it's those shameful experiences that get brought into us that have to force us into a spiritual reconnection that we otherwise might not have undertaken.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, so much.
Thank
Beautiful.
you.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Sending love, high vibes. And my friend Dayal, oh my goodness, that was so good. That was like spot on. I love it. If you were to leave us with a couple of parting words, and by the way, we're going to share links so you can stay in touch with Dayal on Instagram, his websites, different courses, etc. But what might you lead us with? You know, knowing that we don't have, many of us don't have the 20 plus years that you have, but we've discovered this practice. There's something about bhakti that's making us somehow a little bit better person, a little bit, you know, connected to something greater than ourselves. What would you offer us as we continue walking this path?
Yeah. Very briefly, I would say don't be afraid of the truth and hold the trust that ultimately spirit is guiding you exactly where you need to be. So there's some questions about what does this look like specifically? What are the steps? And I'm usually not a like, these are the 5 tools you need to practice in your life right now. If you start this, you'll get healed, because it's less about doing specific things and more about changing the way in which you view yourself and the world around you. And so don't be afraid of the truth, whatever that may mean in your life. Be courageous, be bold, be self-reflective. I love how Laura mentioned the quiet, right? Whatever you're feeling uncomfortable with or running away from in the quiet really is the work that we need to be able to do with ourselves. So don't be afraid of the truth. And also trust that ultimately you're being guided back by spirit where you need to be. And everything is ultimately, it can be cliche to say, but it's truly unfolding in a way for you to be where you need to be. This talk was not just something you happen to be on. It's not just something that I happen to stumble into. We're here for a reason, and we're being guided towards wholeness and healing and restoration.
I love
So there's
it.
hope.
I love it. Amazing. Well, our love and high vibes and appreciation to you, Dayal, sending it over to Brooklyn, New York. And friends, thank you so much for being here with us. Wishing you an amazing rest of the day, and we'll see you soon. Hare
Thank
Krishna.
you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Hare
Peace.
Hare
Namaste.
Krishna.
Krishna. Thank you, Dayal.
Haribol.
Beautiful.
Hare
Hari.
Krishna.
Hare Krishna.